got an ancient little guitar here. This is, so far, the oldest Martin I've ever had the pleasure to see. The owner has actually been in contact with the company historians, and as far as I can tell, this is from the 1840s. And this guitar has an X-brace in it, which makes it one of the very earliest X-braced Martin guitars in existence. The earliest documented one so far was from 1843. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, there weren't really any style designations at that point in their history. You know, this is just a nice little guitar, equivalent perhaps to a number 221. Even that's kind of pushing it, because most of the style 21s had a herringbone pattern rosette, and this has got this reversing block marquetry. What makes this one kind of interesting is it was re-necked by the factory. It's had a history of other repairs too, of course, and on the whole, it feels very solid. Like it's ready to go, you know? The owner would like me to have a look at some of the various cracks in there and make sure that they're cleated and solid. And I noticed there was a slight buzz coming from the 6th string. If you play hard, so we might have a low nut slot. The 1840s were a time of experimentation for Christian F. Martin I. He was working with different bracing patterns, some of which seem like they may have been inspired by contemporary Spanish guitars. There's fan bracing in some, and occasionally a slipper foot, which this guitar shows. You'll note that there are two stamps. The one on the slipper itself says New York, and the one on the neck block, which is later, says Nazareth. Funny thing is, this guitar was likely built and repaired in the same place, in Pennsylvania. Martin was only in New York for about 6 years before he decided that the countryside was much more to his liking, so they moved almost immediately. But they kept using the stamp from New York for several decades, probably because it had a certain cachet, you know, big city stuff. The neck here does seem to be made of Spanish cedar, which doesn't actually come from Spain. It's lighter in weight than mahogany, though pretty similar visually. The pores in the wood are usually longer, but it's a similar pinky brown orange color. Very nice. Looking at these tuners, an interesting modification was made on both sides of them. They clipped one of the decorative ends there. Maybe it was protruding too far below the back and pinching your finger when you were trying to turn the button. I think that's interesting. These would not be original 1840s tuners. These are a later addition. So this is really neat. This is a penciled note on the underside of the soundboard. It's located between the base arm of the X-brace and what we'll call the finger or cutoff brace. It says, repaired by C.F. Martin and Company, January 18th, 1900, and there are initials JJK. Martin time books of that period tell us that is J.J. Knecht, or Knecht, who was an employee of long standing in the late 1800s. And this tells us that the repair required the removal of the back and or the soundboard. And no, this inscription is not reversed like Leonardo da Vinci's writing. It's really not in a place that's easily viewable in a mirror with the light sources that were available at that time. They weren't using LED inspection lights in 1900, and sticking a candle in the sound hole was frowned upon. I'm not sure if there was a defined repair department at that stage. You know, there are photos of the workers posing together near the workshop entrance, and it's usually 9 or 10 people. So it wasn't a big staff at that point. Most of those guys were still German-born immigrants. There's some speculation that the more senior craftsmen would handle repair jobs like this, just due to, you know, experience and familiarity. Let's look at the headstock here, and we'll check out the dart. This little triangular thing, which is, it's a hallmark for Martin guitars. In the early days, the headstock was a separate piece that was grafted onto the neck shaft with something called a bird's mouth joint, which is pretty sophisticated woodworking, which involves really tight tolerances and a bunch of geometry. It's a wonder to behold if you've actually seen one. At a certain point, they gave that up, I guess in the cause of expediency, and just started carving the head from the same piece of lumber as the neck, and the dart became purely decorative. This is one of those. This is not an 1840s piece of joinery. The back and sides are a nice dark, straight-grained Brazilian rosewood. That really diminutive little heel. You can see there's a couple of back cracks, which are pretty common in this wood from something this old. Something I'll bring up here. When you're polishing guitars, you sometimes see me using the auto body compounds and stuff. You really got to be sort of careful when you've got open cracks or scuff marks or dings and that kind of stuff, because most of those polishes will dry white, and if you get them into the grain, they sort of stick out like a sore thumb. It's not always easy polishing a surface like this that's got scuffs and bumps and dings, and generally an older guitar, it looks better if they're filled with something dark rather than white. So just be aware. If you're going to polish, you might use something like Tripoli or... I really don't want to suggest something, because people tend to do what I say, and I don't want them to do it in this case. There are cracks which run along either side of the fingerboard and break through to the sound hole, so we'll want to make sure those are well supported from below. There's also some difference in color, as if this area had been sanded, which sometimes happens during a neck reset or a neck removal. However, I would assume that after 115 or so years of age that there'd be enough time for these colors to equalize between sanded and unsanded. So I think we're going to assume that this is a much later crack, but it has been repaired. These are bar frets, which are rectangular in cross section as opposed to the T frets that we use these days. And I've noted that some of these are a little bit sharp on the end, so we might dress those down a bit too. There's an interesting treatment of the saddle here. It's got little ears on the end. The owner was concerned about this, about the material. This does appear to be bone. I guess the ears are to give just a little bit of extra width, because the saddle slot itself is quite narrow in comparison to the string spread, which is not uncommon on these guys. So, you know, I will say this, the fit is a little loose. Let's see if I can clean some of this residue off here with a little bit of naphtha. And try and refresh it with a little bit of tongue oil. Tongue oil doesn't come from my tongue. It's a nut that grows in Asia. This is a natural drying oil, sort of like linseed oil or walnut oil. These are naturally polymerizing oils, so they will harden up over time as they dry out. Yeah, this is... I don't know what went on with this bridge. This is a very strange phenomenon. It's got this milky haze over top of it that doesn't... It's almost like it was finished with some kind of film type finish and then water got under it. It's like what happens with shellac or lacquer if they were kept in a damp basement. You know, sometimes you get that hazy effect. Hey, looking at the saddle slot, you can see that it is slightly irregular. It appears to have been cut by hand, and there's evidence of a score line along the front edge here from something like a marking gauge. Yeah, bar frets tend to be a little sharper on the ends, just as a matter of course. Slightly stiffer feeling. Some of these are definitely extending past the edge of the fingerboard, so we'll get after them with a very small file, used in a very delicate fashion. Just going to soften the corners a little bit too with my safe edge file. It's a compound motion. I'm describing an arc at the same time that I'm rotating it, so you get this rounded corner. I don't like this saddle. It's cut short. I mean, the ears are there, but it's otherwise too short. And I don't think it touches the bottom in certain places. And it's wrong. It's got a shim on the bottom, piece of wood, that doesn't really bother me, but it's just too loose, too short, and too... I gotta make a new one. It's a little bent file. It's actually a checkering tool for working on gun stocks. But it helps to flatten out the bottom of a slot that's really rough. And firm up the corners, you know. The ends of the slot were not cut square, so I'll get in there with a tiny chisel and get rid of the little bit of a slope and the messy stuff at the bottom so the nut fits snug against them. I'll measure the width at several points and endeavor to shape the nut to fit that. I'll sand the blank to the widest point and then pare down from that. This is going to be a very low saddle, so I'm going to fit it slightly looser than I would a tall one, because they can be very difficult to remove otherwise. It should be good firm contact though, all the way along. Still too tight in the center. One day I'll get a professional set of radius gauges. I've been using the same homemade cardboard one for 15 years. Radiusing, radiusing, radiusing. I'm rounding the top of the saddle and shaping the corners into a nice comfortable radius. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the X-brace design. The earliest extant X-brace example that we have of a Martin guitar is from 1843, which was owned by Madame Dolores Nevares de Goñi, who was a Spanish virtuoso born in 1813. She came to America in 1840, started giving concerts and teaching, being very influential. She was a big deal. She played all over, New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, so she really traveled. On some of her performances, she was supported by a guitarist named John Cooper, who happened to be the guy who took over Martin's shop when he left New York for Pennsylvania. They were partners. He was a retailer, and he represented Martin in New York City. There are guitars from the 1840s labeled Martin and Cooper. It was likely Cooper who got Martin interested in design elements from Southern Europe, Spanish influence, stuff that was different from the Viennese model that he'd been training in. So fan bracing, that's what got him on that path. This information was sourced from Martin's Journal of Acoustic Guitars, Volume 9, the bonus content. The article is titled, Martin Honors the First American Guitar. Anyway, the story goes, Martin used to entertain musicians during the summer, and Cooper brought Goñi at some point. He showed her this guitar made with this new bracing system he'd been working with. It was slightly larger than what he'd been making previous. It was essentially the first size 1 guitar, a concert size guitar. She loved it. She basically became his first unofficial endorsee, brought the guitar everywhere, everyone heard it, loved it. So she was an important teacher, serious composer, really the one who brought what we consider classical guitar to America. And her legacy was huge, but really it was lost almost completely for a long time. Her compositions were unplayed and unpublished for about a century. As it happens, my friend and fellow Hamiltonian, Emma Rush, has been focusing on a lot of this overlooked 19th century guitar material from female composers, including Dolores de Goñi. So she's posted a video. I'm going to leave a link in the video description. You should listen to it. In this case, she's playing a Stauffer replica with whom Martin apprenticed, so it's kind of period appropriate. The bracing in this guitar is virtually identical to the Degonia example. Same little bridge pad in the same shape, same secondary braces parallel to the lower part of the X, the same sharp, knife-like profile on the braces. Here's the neck block, which was replaced, seemingly over top of a pad of cedar that mirrors the slipper foot, except on the top. Interestingly, Martin didn't make integral Spanish heels. They were always dovetailed into a cross-grained block. And this one was placed over the slipper foot. You can tell by the way the glue has dribbled down that this was done with the top facing upwards, which is interesting. Note the glue blocks, or the tenteones. They're of different sizes, and I can see rosewood through each of those curves. That's not continuous lining. Cracks in the side have been shored up with these really regular spaced cleats. This being the back, note that it also has individual glue blocks. It's not a continuous strip of kerf lining. That's going to give the guitar builders in the audience something to ponder. Here in the lower bout, where there were quite a number of cracks, Knecht decided to laminate a piece of rosewood veneer that runs opposite to the grain of the side. You can see that it extends under the glue blocks, which again are not continuous. So it's possible he replaced all of the original lining with blocks. Now you see these on the tops of early Martins, but they tend to be larger, coarser, and more widely spaced. Note the scuff marks on the top from where he put the knife during removal. This is an otherwise perfectly good nut, but the bass E is about 5/1000ths too low. With the soft nylon core strings and its overall prospects, I don't think it's going to face a whole lot of wear and tear and restringing, so I feel okay about making a fill of bone dust and superglue in this case. It's important to stab the bottom of the slot and rough it up to give the glue something to grip to, I think. Then I add a little bit of bone dust, a tiny drop of glue, let that harden, and then polish the resulting surface. Let's see what the action is looking like. Got about 5/64ths on the bass side, which is okay. On the treble, about 7, which is not okay. So I want to remove the better part of a 32nd of an inch. So as the old axiom states, if we want to reduce the saddle height at the 12th fret by a certain amount, we need to remove double that amount from the saddle. And of course I take that off the bottom. And in this case I want to leave the bass side alone, so this is going to be an angled kind of a cut, tapering away to nothing on the bass side. The owner would like to try some Nile gut on this. This is Aquila. This would be probably the light gauge. Yeah. Alabastro light. This of course poses a question when you're dealing with gut strings or nylon strings on this kind of guitar with a pin bridge, and they don't happen to be ball end strings. How do you make it work? You simply tie a knot in the end of them. 2 square knots. I like to leave a little bit of a tail there. And in this case we have peg, and we're dealing with this end, of course. I don't leave a lot of slack with these nylon strings. If I pick the string up in the center of the board, there's only that much slack. Because being nylon, if you put too much on there, you're going to end up with like 30,000 turns on the barrel of the tuner, and that will take an awful long time to stretch and to maintain the tuning. And you don't have to get too fancy with this knot here. What I do is I pull the string up, go around the side of the string that's facing the body of the guitar, come back down through, pull it taut, and that's ready to go. I can cut it off now or I can cut it off later. On the outside E strings, I wrap towards the center of the headstock. 2 frets were slightly high, so I tapped them with my fretting hammer to make sure they were seated down in the slot, and then filed a little bit, and then repolished that area. Let's have a look at this guitar too, as it just happens to be here. This is a super nice little Washburn, which is very similar to the one I replaced the bridge on last month, despite the fact that this is like 40 years younger. This one was made in 1925. It's got gorgeous Brazilian rosewood. And this one needs virtually nothing, so I'm not going to take you through it all, but basically I'm just going to polish the frets and change the strings. You can see here that it's got a fret for a saddle. This is not uncommon for catalog guitars in the 1910s and 20s. It's really funny when you see it because you've got the super high quality tone woods involved, and they made a little cost-cutting concession like this. The wood really was cheap at that time. So the action on this guitar might even be just a little bit low, but it plays cleanly. So the question is, should we replace something like this with a standard bone saddle? If the action was high and it needed a neck reset, I would almost certainly do that at the same time. If for no other reason, then we would need some level of adjustability to dial in the action. But as it is, it's functioning fine, and it's part of the original design. It's kind of quaint, so might as well keep it. The Washburn label has a great little note about how your warranty is good only if you haven't mutilated the label. Back to the Martin. Okay, in summation, this is the second oldest guitar I've ever handled, the oldest Martin. We can only speculate what happened that necessitated the total replacement of the neck. I mean, the guys at Martin certainly had the skills to graft on a new headstock if that was broken, but they didn't do that in this case, and instead took off the back of the guitar to access the neck block, double the side, do the cracks and cleats and such. That's not an insignificant amount of work. January in Pennsylvania is the perfect time of year for that kind of thing. The shop would be bone dry at that point, and the body would be at its absolute smallest dimensions. That would cut down on the chance for future cracking due to shrinkage. I think it's interesting that they left the repair note. I also think it's interesting that they decided to leave the slipper foot in place, preserving some of the history. It seems like they had an appreciation of the instrument as an object of cultural nostalgia, a reverence for the company's previous work. And that says a lot about the ethic of Martin workers at the turn of the 20th century. Or is it the turn of the 19th century? Is the turn of the century the beginning or the end? I've never seen a conclusive definition for that phrase. I've probably always used it in the wrong way. It's fun to investigate old stuff. Next week I'll have a really crazy repair. I'm doing it right now. You guys are going to get a kick out of this one. It's an electric, and oh boy. Anyway, we shall see you then.